They thought she was just an old woman who didn't belong. One shove, one moment of cruelty, and a room full of powerful people chose to look away, but they didn't see the man standing nearby. They didn't notice the quiet Navy SEAL who never raised his voice. And they completely underestimated the German Shepherd who refused to move. Because that night wasn't about power, it was about patience. And what happens when someone who's been forgotten finally decides to stand back up? What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Charleston woke up under a sky the color of dull steel. A cold Atlantic wind rolled in from the harbor, cutting through the narrow streets like a blade that had learned the city's shape by heart. The air smelled of salt, old bricks, and something faintly metallic, rain that had fallen hours earlier and still clung to the stone sidewalks. The weather was not dramatic, not stormy, just harsh enough to remind people that comfort in this city was always temporary. Most mornings, Charleston moved quickly. Delivery trucks growled awake. Cafe doors opened with the soft clatter of metal chairs. Runners passed with headphones on, eyes forward, chasing personal victories no one else could see. And then there was Caleb Rowan, moving against the rhythm. He walked slowly, deliberately, as if each step required permission from something unseen. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with a build that hadn't softened with age but had learned restraint. Broad shoulders sat beneath a faded canvas, jacket that had once been green and was now the color of memory. His jeans were worn at the knees, boots scuffed but carefully maintained. A faint scar cut through his right eyebrow, old and clean, the kind that no longer asked for attention. Caleb's face was angular, weathered not by time but by decisions. His jaw was square, usually clenched, not from anger, but from habit. He kept his dark hair cropped short, military short, though the silver threading through it suggested he had been out longer than he liked to admit. He wore no jewelry, no watch, nothing that tied him to schedules or promises. Beside him walked a German Shepherd, large even by the breed standards. Her name was Valkyrie, though Caleb almost always called her Val. She was 9 years old, her black and tan coat still thick but beginning to gray faintly around the muzzle. Her ears stood alert, scarred at the edges from old injuries that had healed cleanly but never disappeared. Her eyes were deep amber, intelligent and unsettlingly focused, the kind of eyes that did not look at the world but measured it. Val walked on Caleb's left side, half a step behind, leash loose, posture perfect without being rigid. People noticed the dog first. They always did. Children paused. Adults stepped aside without knowing why. Other dogs pulled against their owners, barking or whining, sensing something disciplined and unyielding in her presence. Val never reacted. She had learned long ago that noise wasted energy. Caleb rarely spoke during these walks. He didn't need to. Val understood the cadence of his breathing, the subtle shifts in his shoulders, the way his hand tightened almost imperceptibly when something made him uneasy. They had trained together once, long ago, under different skies. Different rules. Caleb Rowan had been a Navy SEAL. The city didn't know that. The city didn't need to. He had left the team 7 years earlier, not with ceremony or applause, but with a medical discharge that said more between the lines than on them. A knee injury, officially. Unofficially, it was the accumulation of things that never made it into reports. Decisions made in darkness, names that never reached public ears, faces that returned in dreams, no matter how carefully he avoided sleep. Charleston was supposed to be quiet, a place where ghosts stayed buried. It worked most days. Caleb and Val passed a small diner on East Bay Street. Inside, an older waitress with tired eyes and dyed red hair waved at him through the window. Her name was Sarah Whitlock. She was in her late 40s, tall and slightly stooped from years of leaning over tables, with pale skin freckled by the southern sun and a voice that carried warmth even when she was exhausted. She'd lost her husband to a heart attack 3 years earlier and filled the silence with long shifts and forced smiles. Caleb ate there once a week, always the same order, always at the counter, always leaving exact change and a little extra. Sarah waved. Caleb nodded back. That was the extent of most of his social life. They turned toward the harbor, where the water slapped against wooden pylons with dull persistence. Cargo ships loomed in the distance, patient and enormous, waiting their turn to be useful. Val paused briefly, nose lifting, catching a scent carried on the wind, Oil, rust, something unfamiliar. Caleb stopped with her, scanning the area out of habit. Nothing. They resumed walking. Caleb lived in a narrow two-story house not far from the docks, a place that creaked in the wind and smelled faintly of old wood and seawater. He had chosen it for its anonymity, no front porch worth lingering on, no yard that invited conversation, just walls, a roof, and silence. Inside, the house was clean but sparse, a couch with one corner permanently claimed by Val, a small kitchen with mismatched plates, framed photographs turned face down on a shelf he pretended not to notice. The only decoration was a folded American flag in a shadow box mounted on the wall above his desk, given to him after a mission that had ended badly. That mission had changed him. Before it, Caleb had been sharper, quicker to smile, quicker to speak. After it, words felt heavier, as if each one needed to justify its existence. He became quieter, not withdrawn but deliberate, measuring interactions the same way he once measured threats. Val had changed too. She had been younger then, faster, reckless in the way only the best working dogs were. On that mission, she had dragged him out from behind a concrete barrier after an explosion threw him to the ground. Shrapnel had torn into her flank. She never made a sound, not once. They stitched her up under fire. After that, she refused to leave his side. The Navy eventually retired her. Caleb took her with him when he left. There had never been a question. That morning, after the walk, Caleb clipped Val's leash to a hook by the door and poured water into her bowl. She ate methodically, then lay down, chin resting on her paws, eyes following him as he moved through the kitchen. "Be good," he murmured, the words automatic. Val's tail thumped once. Caleb picked up a small package wrapped in brown paper from the table. A neighbor had asked him to drop it off at the Harbor Crown Hotel later that evening. An old military watch that had belonged to her father, now being returned to a former unit buddy attending a corporate event there. Caleb hadn't wanted to go. He never did. But favors were debts, and he paid his. Outside, the wind strengthened. Clouds pressed lower, flattening the light until the city looked drained of color. Charleston felt older on days like this, less charming, more honest. Caleb didn't know it yet, but that night, something long dormant would wake up. A line he had drawn years ago and sworn never to cross again would blur. The quiet life he had built, carefully, deliberately, would fracture under the weight of a single moment. For now, though, it was just another cold morning, a man walking slower than the city, and a dog who never stopped watching. By the time evening settled over Charleston, the wind had sharpened. It funneled through the streets with a restless persistence, rattling window frames and carrying the distant sound of ship horns from the harbor. The city looked polished from a distance, its historic facades glowing under carefully placed lights. But up close, the cold found every gap. It slipped beneath collars and cuffs, reminding anyone outside that comfort here was conditional. The Harbor Crown Hotel rose at the edge of the waterfront like a monument to controlled excess. Its white stone exterior was scrubbed clean, its glass doors revolving smoothly under the hands of guests dressed in dark suits and long coats. Inside, warmth waited, artificial, deliberate, expensive. Crystal chandeliers spilled light across marble floors, and the air smelled faintly of citrus polish and champagne. Caleb Rowan stood across the street, the brown paper-wrapped package tucked under his arm. He watched the hotel the way he once watched buildings before entering them, noting exits, sightlines, patterns of movement. Old habits did not fade, they simply went quiet. At his side, Valkyrie sat with disciplined patience. Her posture was calm, but her ears tracked every sound, every shift in tone from the crowd moving in and out of the hotel. At 9 years old, she was no longer young, but she carried herself with the confidence of an animal that had survived worse than a cold night in a crowded lobby. Her coat gleamed under the streetlight, dark saddle sharp against tan legs, muscles still firm beneath the fur. "You stay," Caleb murmured, clipping the leash short and securing it to a wrought iron railing. Val looked up at him, amber eyes steady. She did not like being separated from him in unfamiliar places, but she trusted his judgment. Her tail thumped once against the metal, a promise, not obedience. Caleb crossed the street and stepped through the revolving door. Warmth closed around him immediately. So did noise. Laughter echoed off high ceilings, layered with music from a string quartet positioned near the far wall. Men and women clustered in small groups, glasses in hand, faces arranged into practiced expressions of ease and success. The event banners announced Holloway Logistics, 50 years, in elegant lettering. Caleb moved carefully through the lobby, conscious of his own contrast against the room. His jacket was clean but plain, his boots practical rather than fashionable. He felt the subtle glances, the quick assessments that categorized him as staff or service or something adjacent to importance but not quite part of it. He was used to that. In many ways, he preferred it. He approached the reception desk to leave the package, but his attention snagged on a disturbance near the security checkpoint to the ballroom. An elderly woman stood there, alone. She was small, perhaps 5'3", with a frame that suggested strength worn thin by time rather than fragility. She wore a deep blue wool coat, tailored but old-fashioned, buttoned neatly to her throat. Her hair was silver, pulled back into a low bun that revealed a long, elegant neck. Her skin was pale, lined in a way that spoke of years spent outdoors rather than behind desks. There was nothing careless about her appearance, nothing confused. The man blocking her path could not have been more different. Blake Ashford looked like he had been constructed for rooms like this. He was in his mid-30s, tall and lean, his dark hair cut short on the sides and styled carefully on top. His jaw was sharply defined, clean-shaven except for a faint shadow that suggested he shaved often, but not always well. He wore a tailored black suit and moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His expression, however, was brittle, polite on the surface, edged with impatience underneath. Caleb did not know Blake's name yet, but he recognized the type immediately. Blake spoke with his hands as sirs, much as his mouth, gestures precise, dismissive. "Ma'am," he said, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry, "this is a private event. If you're looking for the public lounge, it's down the hall." The woman met his gaze calmly. Her eyes were a striking blue, sharp despite her age. "I'm not lost," she said. Her voice was steady, unaccented, carrying quiet authority. "I was invited." Blake's smile tightened. He glanced at the tablet in his hand, scrolling quickly. "Your name isn't on the list." "I don't believe that list is complete," she replied. A few nearby guests slowed, curiosity flickering across their faces before being masked by polite indifference. No one stepped closer. No one intervened. Caleb stopped walking. He told himself he was only observing, that there was no reason to involve himself. He had promised himself that when he left the teams, he would not go looking for confrontation. He had earned his quiet. Blake sighed. The sound exaggerated. "Ma'am, I don't have time for this. Please, move aside." The woman shifted her weight, attempting to step past him. Blake reacted without thinking. His hand came out, palm open. Not violent in intent, but careless, dismissive. He pushed her shoulder as one might push aside a chair. The movement was small. The consequence was not. The woman's heel slipped on the polished marble. Her balance failed. She fell hard, one knee striking the floor, her hand splaying out instinctively to break the impact. The sound cut through the lobby, a sharp, unmistakable crack of bone meeting stone. Everything stopped. For a fraction of a second, Blake looked surprised, then irritated. "You should watch where you're going," he muttered. That was when Caleb moved. He crossed the remaining distance quickly, his steps controlled but urgent. He knelt beside the woman, ignoring Blake entirely. Up close, he could see the fine tremor in her hand, the way she clenched her jaw to keep from showing pain. "Don't try to stand yet," Caleb said quietly. His voice was low, calm, the same tone he had used countless times in worse situations. "Let me check you." She looked at him, really looked, as if measuring him in return. "I've taken harder falls," she said, but she did not pull away when he offered his arm. Around them, the room held its breath. Blake straightened, color rising in his cheeks. "This is unnecessary," he said sharply. "She tripped." Caleb did not look up. "She didn't." There was no accusation in his voice, just certainty. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Phones shifted in hands. Somewhere near the door, a bellhop hesitated, torn between protocol and instinct. From outside, faint but unmistakable, came a low sound, a growl, not loud, not frantic, controlled. Caleb felt it before he heard it, the familiar vibration of warning carried through space. He glanced toward the glass doors and saw Valkyrie, body rigid, ears forward, eyes locked on Blake through the pain. Her reflection doubled her presence, making her look larger, more imposing. She did not bark. She did not lunge. She waited. Blake noticed her then. His eyes flicked to the door, then back to Caleb. "Is that your dog?" he snapped. "Get it under control." Caleb finally stood. He was taller than Blake by a few inches, broader through the shoulders. Up close, the scar through his eyebrow was visible, as were the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, marks of a man who had squinted into sun and smoke and distance. His expression was unreadable, not angry, not calm, simply present. "She's under control," Caleb said. "You aren't." The woman accepted his help and rose slowly, favoring her knee but refusing assistance beyond his arm. She straightened her coat with deliberate care, as if reclaiming something Blake had no right to disturb. Security began to move, uncertain but aware that something had shifted. Conversations resumed in low, uneasy tones. The woman turned to Caleb. "Thank you," she said, "for not pretending this didn't happen." Caleb nodded. "You're welcome." He did not know her name. He did not yet understand the weight of the moment he had stepped into. He only knew that the quiet he had built so carefully had cracked, and once broken, silence was difficult to restore. Outside, Valkyrie remained still, eyes never leaving the door. The night was not over. The lobby did not return to normal after the woman was helped to her feet. It pretended to, the way people often do when something unsettling interrupts their evening plans, but the pretense was thin. Conversations resumed at half volume. Laughter sounded forced, arriving a beat too late. The music from the quartet continued, but it no longer anchored the room. It floated awkwardly above the tension like wallpaper peeling from a wall. Caleb remained beside the woman, his body angled slightly toward her, a posture that came not from conscious decision, but from instinct. Protection, not possession. Presence, not dominance. He could feel the tremor still running through her arm where she leaned lightly against him, subtle but undeniable, pain masked by pride. "Can you put weight on it?" he asked quietly, nodding toward her injured knee. "I can," she replied. Her voice was steady, but there was a faint tightness around the words. "Whether I should is another matter." Caleb allowed himself a brief, almost smile. "Fair." A man in a dark blue security blazer approached, his steps hesitant, his eyes flicking between Blake Ashford and the woman, as if choosing the safer option. He was in his early 40s, with thinning hair and a face shaped by years of conflict avoidance. His name tag read Evan Mercer, head of event security for the hotel. He had the look of a man who had built his career on smoothing things over, rather than drawing lines. "Ma'am," Evan began, voice careful, "would you like me to call medical assistance?" The woman studied him for a moment. Up close, the lines on her face formed a map of a life lived deliberately. This was not a woman unused to rooms like this. Her gaze sharpened, assessing Evan not as an employee, but as a man. "Not yet," she said, "but I would like a chair." Evan snapped his fingers, relief washing over his features. A nearby attendant hurried forward with a padded chair, placing it carefully behind her. She sat with composure, folding her hands in her lap, the image of dignity restored by will alone. Blake Ashford watched the exchange with visible irritation. The flush in his face had deepened, creeping up his neck toward his ears. He was a man accustomed to control, and control had slipped through his fingers in front of an audience. "This is being blown out of proportion," Blake said, addressing no one in particular. His voice was louder now, defensive. "She stumbled, that's all." Caleb turned toward him slowly. He did not step closer. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at Blake with the same steady focus he once reserved for men deciding whether to make fatal mistakes. "You put your hand on her," Caleb said. "That's not a stumble," Blake scoffed. "And who are you supposed to be, her lawyer?" "No," Caleb replied. "Just a witness." That word hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. Several people nearby shifted uncomfortably. One man, a heavy-set executive with gray hair and a loosened tie, cleared his throat and looked away. A woman in a red dress lifted her phone slightly, then hesitated, lowering it again. No one wanted to be first to acknowledge what had happened, but no one could fully deny it either. The woman in the chair watched all of this in silence. Her eyes moved from face to face, noting reactions, cataloging them. When she finally spoke, the room leaned in without realizing it. "Mr. Ashford," she said calmly. Blake turned, startled despite himself. "Yes?" "You seem very certain of your authority here." Blake straightened instinctively, smoothing his jacket. "I am the CEO of Holloway Logistics," he said. "This event exists because of my decisions." A ripple passed through the crowd. Some nodded reflexively, others frowned. The woman tilted her head slightly. How long have you held that position? Blake hesitated, just a fraction. 18 months. And before that, I was brought in to modernize the company, he said quickly, to fix inefficiencies. She smiled then, but it was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had heard this story before, many times, told by many men. Modernization is a convenient word, she said. It often excuses cruelty. Blake's jaw tightened. With respect, ma'am, I don't think this is the time or place. It's exactly the time, she interrupted gently, and this place belongs to the truth, whether you like it or not. A younger woman stepped forward from the edge of the group. She could not have been more than 26, slender, with dark brown hair pulled into a tight ponytail and a badge clipped to her dress reading Lena Brooks, Compliance Analyst. Her posture was rigid, as if every step forward required conscious effort. I saw it, Lena said, her voice trembling but clear. He pushed her. Blake spun toward her. Lena, this isn't your concern. It is, she replied. Her hands shook, but she did not retreat. It's everyone's. Caleb noticed the way Lena's shoulders lifted defensively, the way she braced for impact that did not come. He recognized that stance, fear held in check by resolve. Evan Mercer looked between them, panic creeping into his expression. Let's all take a breath, he said, attempting to regain control of the situation. We can move this conversation somewhere private. The woman in the chair rose slowly, ignoring Caleb's instinctive move to assist. She stood on her own, testing her balance, then straightened fully. No, she said, we will not hide this. She turned, addressing the room now, her voice carrying effortlessly. For 50 years, this company has moved goods across borders and oceans. It has weathered recessions, strikes, and wars. It did not survive by pretending discomfort didn't exist. A murmur of recognition spread. Some faces changed, eyes narrowing with dawning realization. Blake stared at her. Who are you? He demanded. She met his gaze without blinking. You should know that already. Caleb felt the shift then, the subtle change in gravity. He had felt it before, moments before doors were kicked in, before plans unraveled. The air grew dense, expectant. Before Blake could respond, a sharp bark cut through the lobby. Val, not a growl this time. A single decisive bark from outside the glass doors. Heads turned. The German shepherd stood tall, leash taut against the railing, eyes fixed on Blake with unwavering focus. The reflection in the glass made her look like two dogs instead of one. Caleb did not need to look at her to understand. She sensed escalation. She was ready. Evan swallowed hard. Sir, he said to Blake, perhaps we should step aside. Blake glanced at the crowd, at the phones now openly raised, at the woman whose calm had somehow dismantled his authority more effectively than shouting ever could. For the first time that night, uncertainty crept into his expression. Fine, he snapped. This is absurd. He turned to walk away. The woman spoke one last time, her voice quiet but unyielding. You don't get to leave yet. Blake froze. Caleb exhaled slowly through his nose. The quiet life he had guarded so carefully was gone now, displaced by something older and heavier, responsibility. He glanced once toward Val through the glass, meeting her eyes. She remained still, alert, loyal. The room waited. Whatever came next would not be small. The room did not explode when the woman told Blake Ashford he was not allowed to leave. It didn't need to. Silence, when it arrives honestly, carries more force than shouting ever could. Blake stood frozen with his back half turned, one hand still clenched around his phone. For a man who had built his authority on movement, entering rooms with confidence, exiting conversations on his own terms, the sudden stillness was disorienting. He looked, for the first time that night, like a man unsure of where to put his weight. You don't get to tell me where I can and can't go, he said finally, turning back. His voice was tight, brittle at the edges. This is my event. A few hours earlier, that statement would have ended the conversation. Now it landed awkwardly, like a rehearsed line delivered after the audience had stopped believing in the play. The woman regarded him calmly. Up close, the faint tremor in her knee had settled into a controlled stiffness. She stood with her hands loosely clasped in front of her, posture straight despite the pain she was clearly ignoring. Her coat, deep blue and heavy with age, hung from narrow shoulders that had once carried responsibility comfortably. Your event, she repeated. Yes, that's what you believe. Caleb felt the room lean forward, not physically, but emotionally, as if every person present sensed that something irreversible was unfolding. He shifted slightly, placing himself half a step closer to the woman without making it obvious. He was not trying to intimidate Blake. He was preparing. Evan Mercer hovered nearby, his expression drawn. Sweat glistened faintly at his temples, despite the cool air. "Ma'am," he said cautiously, "perhaps we should continue this in a private conference room. For everyone's sake." "For whose sake?" the woman asked. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Yours, his, or the people standing here who just watched me be pushed to the ground?" Evan swallowed. He looked like a man who had spent years enforcing rules without ever questioning who they served. "I just want to prevent things from escalating." "Then you should have prevented the push," she replied. That landed harder than anything Blake had said. A man near the bar cleared his throat. He was in his late 50s, heavy set, with thinning gray hair and a face permanently set into an expression of mild concern. His name badge read Thomas Reed, board liaison. He had been standing quietly since the incident, observing, calculating. Unlike Blake, Thomas had learned long ago that survival in corporate spaces depended less on dominance and more on timing. "Perhaps," Thomas said carefully, "we should hear the lady out." Blake shot him a look. "This doesn't concern you?" Thomas adjusted his glasses. "On the contrary, Blake, it concerns all of us." The woman turned toward Thomas, studying him. "You remember the East Coast expansion? In the late 90s, she said. Thomas stiffened. "Yes," he replied slowly. "I was junior counsel at the time." "And the dockworkers' strike in Savannah?" "I helped draft the mediation agreement," he said, his voice quieter now. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by disbelief. Blake noticed the change and felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What is this?" he demanded. "Some kind of performance?" The woman reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small, flat object. She did not hold it up dramatically. She simply placed it on the marble-topped registration desk. It was an old company badge, not the modern plastic kind clipped to jackets that evening, but metal, worn smooth around the edges. The original Holloway Logistics emblem was engraved into its surface, the lettering slightly faded but unmistakable. "I don't perform," she said. "I build." A wave passed through the room, subtle but undeniable. Whispers sparked. Names, half-remembered, rising to the surface of collective memory. Thomas Reed's face drained of color. "Margaret," he said under his breath. "Margaret Holloway." The name traveled faster than sound. Blake's mouth opened, then closed. His eyes flicked from the badge to the woman's face, searching for cracks, for signs of deception. He found none. "That's not possible," he said. "Margaret Holloway retired years ago." The woman, Margaret Holloway, inclined her head slightly. "I stepped back from daily operations," she corrected. "I did not disappear, and I certainly did not give up ownership." Caleb felt it then, the collective recalibration. The way people straightened unconsciously, the way loyalties began to shift before anyone consciously chose them. Power, he had learned, was often invisible until it moved. Blake laughed, sharp and hollow. "This is absurd. Even if you are who you claim to be, you don't just walk into an event and start making accusations." Margaret met his gaze. "I didn't walk in to accuse. I walked in to observe. You made the rest very easy." Lena Brooks stood rigid near the edge of the group, her hands clenched at her sides. She looked from Margaret to Blake, then to Caleb, as if anchoring herself to the reality unfolding in front of her. She had spent months convincing herself that speaking up would change nothing. Watching this, she realized how wrong that belief had been. "I have been watching this company for 8 months, Margaret continued, quietly, carefully. "I wanted to understand what kind of man was leading what I built." Blake scoffed. "And you think pushing you proves something?" "No," Margaret said. "I think it revealed everything." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Caleb glanced toward the glass doors. Valkyrie remained where he had left her, body aligned squarely toward the lobby, eyes unwavering. She did not bark again. She did not need to. Her presence was enough. Thomas Reed stepped forward. "Blake," he said, his tone shifting from cautious to firm, "perhaps we should pause the event." Blake rounded on him. "You don't have the authority?" Thomas smiled thinly. "I do when the majority shareholder is standing in front of us." That word, shareholder, hit Blake harder than any accusation. Margaret turned slightly, addressing the room rather than Blake now. "I am not here to humiliate anyone," she said, But I will not allow a culture of intimidation to hide behind titles. Not in my company. Caleb watched Blake's posture collapse inward by degrees. The man who had pushed an elderly woman aside without a second thought now looked cornered, his confidence leaking away under the weight of witnesses and history. "Security," Margaret said calmly, turning to Evan Mercer. "I would like Mr. Ashford to remain here until the board convenes." Evan hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Blake's voice rose, sharp with panic. "You can't do this." Margaret's expression softened, not with mercy, but with certainty. "I already have." The room exhaled as one. Caleb felt the familiar pull of transition, the moment when a situation crossed from volatile into inevitable. He knew that feeling well. He had lived in it once, long ago, in places far from Charleston. He had sworn never to stand in it again. Yet, here he was. Margaret turned to him. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for stepping in when others didn't." Caleb inclined his head. It was the right thing. She studied him, eyes sharp and curious. People who say that usually learned it the hard way. Caleb did not answer. Outside, Valkyrie shifted her weight, tail low but steady. The night pressed in around the hotel, cold and unforgiving, but inside, something had changed. A truth long buried had surfaced, and it would not be put back. This chapter of the night was over. What followed would be far more difficult. The lobby had changed its posture, not its furniture, not its lighting, not the string quartet still dutifully playing, as if music could glue a fractured evening back together, but its people. They stood differently now. Conversations had thinned into whispers. Shoulders angled toward Margaret Holloway, not Blake Ashford. Power, Caleb knew, did not announce itself. It reoriented rooms. Evan Mercer spoke quietly into his radio, his earlier reluctance replaced by a kind of professional resolve that came from finally knowing which rules mattered. 2 additional security officers arrived and positioned themselves near Blake, careful not to touch him, careful not to escalate. Blake noticed anyway, his jaw flexed. A muscle twitched beneath his left eye, the tell of a man fighting the urge to regain control by force. Margaret lowered herself into the chair again, this time allowing the attendant to steady it. The stiffness in her knee had not vanished. She had simply learned how to distribute pain without surrendering ground. Caleb watched her hands, steady, veins pronounced, fingers marked by faint scars and age spots. These were hands that had signed contracts, negotiated strikes, and closed doors without slamming them. "Medical assistance is on the way," Evan said, his tone deferential now. "Just to be Zeef." Margaret nodded once. "Thank you." Blake let out a sharp laugh. "This is unbelievable. I'm being treated like a criminal because of a misunderstanding." Thomas Reed turned toward him. The board liaison's mild concern had hardened into something closer to disappointment. "Blake," he said, "the misunderstanding is thinking this is about one shove." Blake bristled. "You're taking her side because of who she is." Thomas met his gaze evenly. "No, I'm listening because of what she represents, and what you forgot." A new figure approached from the corridor leading to the ballroom, a man in his early 60s with a trim, gray beard and wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a charcoal suit that looked chosen for utility rather than fashion. His name badge read Harold Kincaid, interim board chair. He walked with a slight limp, the result of an old cycling accident that had never healed properly, and carried himself with the careful confidence of someone who had learned patience the hard way. "I was briefed," Harold said quietly to Thomas, then turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Holloway." "Harold," she replied, "you look well." He smiled faintly. "You look expected." Margaret's mouth curved. "That's the nicest way anyone's ever said I should have stayed gone." Caleb noticed Blake's eyes dart between them, recalculating. The presence of Harold Kincaid changed the math. This was no longer a social incident. It was governance. Harold addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to pause the evening's program. Please remain in the lobby or return to the bar area. The board will convene shortly." There was no argument. People complied, relief and curiosity warring in equal measure. The crowd thinned, but it did not disperse. Phones buzzed with messages sent to people not present. News traveled faster than decorum. Lena Brooks stood near the column where she had spoken up earlier, her face pale but composed. She clasped her hands together to still their shaking. When her eyes met Caleb's, he gave a small nod. Not encouragement, acknowledgement. It mattered. The EMTs arrived quickly. Jordan Pike, a broad-shouldered man with close-cropped blonde hair and a calm, practiced demeanor, and Renee Alvarez, shorter, dark-haired, with a sharp gaze and hands that moved efficiently. They knelt in front of Margaret, assessing her knee, asking questions in gentle tones. Margaret answered clearly, refusing the offer of a stretcher. "I'll walk," she said, slowly. Renee glanced at Jordan, then nodded. "We'll support you." As they worked, Blake's composure continued to erode. He paced a short line between two marble columns, hands clenching and unclenching. He had not learned how to wait without commanding. Silence pressed on him like a physical force. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "You're all overreacting." No one answered. Caleb moved to the glass doors and unclipped Valkyrie's leash, bringing her inside at a heel. Val's nails clicked softly on the marble as she entered, posture relaxed but alert. She stopped in beside Caleb, sat, and scanned the room once before settling, eyes returning to Blake. Her presence drew glances, then respect. Even those unfamiliar with working dogs sensed discipline when they saw it. Margaret noticed Val and smiled faintly. "She's beautiful," she said to Caleb. "She's old," he replied. Margaret chuckled. "So am I. That doesn't mean we're finished." Harold Kincaid cleared his throat. "Margaret, if you're able, the board would like to hear from you." Privately. Margaret considered, then nodded. "Very well, but not without witnesses." Her gaze flicked briefly to Lena, then to Caleb. "I'd like them present." Blake snapped, "This is outrageous." Harold raised a hand. "Enough." The word carried authority earned over decades. Blake fell silent, though his glare lingered. They moved to a small conference room off the lobby. The space was functional, understated, with a long table and chairs arranged with false symmetry. The door closed, muting the lobby's noise. Margaret sat at the head of the table without being directed. Harold and Thomas took seats nearby. Lena hovered uncertainly until Margaret gestured to a chair. Caleb remained standing near the wall, Valkyrie settling at his feet, her chin resting on her paws. "This company," Margaret began, "was built on accountability, not fear, not theater." Blake scoffed. "You're rewriting history." "No," she replied. "I'm correcting your edits." She turned to Harold. "For 8 months, I've reviewed internal reports, exit interviews, compliance flags that never reached the board, patterns of silence." Lena swallowed. "I tried," she said softly. "I submitted concerns through proper channels." Thomas closed his eyes briefly. "And they died there." Blake leaned forward. "You're accusing me of suppressing reports?" "I'm stating that your leadership created conditions where suppression was rewarded," Margaret said. "Whether you signed every order is irrelevant." Caleb listened, recognizing the cadence of an after-action review. Facts, context, consequences. No theatrics, no mercy either. Harold exhaled slowly. "Blake, pending further review, you are relieved of operational authority, effective immediately." Blake stared at him. "You can't do that." Harold met his gaze. "I can. And I have." The words settled heavily. Margaret rose carefully, testing her knee. "This is not a verdict," she said. "It's a pause. One you should use wisely." Blake's voice cracked. "You ambushed me." Margaret regarded him with something like sadness. "No, you revealed yourself." She turned to Caleb. "I owe you more than thanks," she said quietly. "Would you consider staying?" Caleb hesitated. He had not planned for this. He had not planned for anything beyond delivering a package and returning to quiet. "I don't belong in boardrooms," he said. Margaret smiled. "Neither do bullies. Yet, here we are." Caleb looked down at Valkyrie, then back at Margaret. "I'll stay until she's safe," he said. "Then we'll see." Margaret inclined her head. "That's enough." The meeting ended without ceremony. Blake was escorted to a separate waiting area. The EMTs prepared to leave, satisfied. The lobby waited, hushed and expectant. Outside, the wind pressed against the hotel's glass, relentless. Inside, silence had finally been counted. The night did not end when the conference room door opened. If anything, it grew heavier. The lobby of the Harbor Crown had thinned, but not emptied. People lingered at the edges of conversations, pretending to finish drinks they had long since stopped tasting. The string quartet had finally fallen silent, their instruments packed away with professional discretion. What remained was a low, constant murmur, the sound of 100 private reckonings happening at once. Caleb stood near the doorway. Valkyrie pressed close to his leg, her warmth steady through the fabric of his jeans. Val's ears shifted as people passed, cataloging movement without reacting. She had settled into watchfulness, the kind that comes after the immediate threat has passed, but the situation remains unresolved. Caleb recognized the state. It was where most damage occurred, after adrenaline, before clarity. Margaret Holloway emerged from the conference room, supported lightly by Harold Kincaid. She waved away, further assistance, refusing the wheelchair offered by hotel staff. Her knee protested with every step, but she kept her pace even, her spine straight. Pain, she had learned long ago, was negotiable. Authority was not. Blake Ashford remained in the waiting area off to the side, seated now, hands clasped tightly between his knees. The fight had gone out of him in stages. First arrogance, then anger, then disbelief. What remained was calculation, less confident, more desperate. He stared at the carpet as if it might offer answers. It did not. Margaret paused when she reached the center of the lobby. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "This evening is concluded," she said. "Those of you who are guests may leave. Employees, I'll speak with you tomorrow." A ripple of relief passed through the room. People moved quickly now, eager to escape with their interpretations intact. Some avoided Margaret's gaze. Others nodded respectfully, eyes bright with something like gratitude. Lena Brooks stood frozen near the column until Margaret met her eyes and inclined her head. Lena exhaled shakily, then gathered her bag and left, shoulders lighter than they had been hours earlier. Caleb remained. He did not know why exactly. Obligation, perhaps? Or the simple understanding that the story was not finished yet. Margaret noticed him lingering. "Mr. Rowan," she said, "would you walk with me?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." They moved slowly toward the quieter side corridor overlooking the harbor. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the dark water outside, lights from docked ships trembling across the surface. The wind pressed faintly against the glass, insistent but muted. For a moment, neither spoke. "You don't belong to this world," Margaret said finally. Caleb glanced at her. "Neither do you," he replied. She smiled. "I built it. That gives me certain privileges. And certain responsibilities," he said. "Yes," she agreed softly. "Those don't expire." They stopped near the window. Val lay down at Caleb's feet, head resting on her paws, eyes half closed but alert. Her breathing slowed, the rhythm of a dog who trusted the humans nearby to handle what came next. "I've met many men like Blake," Margaret said. "Brilliant on paper, dangerous in practice." Caleb watched a cargo ship ease into the harbor, guided by lights and unseen hands. "They mistake fear for respect," he said, "and obedience for loyalty," she added. Margaret studied him more closely now. In the softer light, she could see the faint stiffness in his posture, the way he favored one knee slightly when he shifted his weight. Injuries that never quite healed, battles that never quite ended. "You were military," she said. Not a question. "Yes. Special operations," she continued. He nodded once. "Why leave?" Caleb considered the question carefully. "Because I stayed too long," Margaret accepted that without pressing. "I did the same thing," she said, "just in a different uniform." Footsteps approached. Harold Kincaid joined them, hands folded behind his back. His expression was thoughtful, the look of a man who had just made several decisions he would be living with for years. "We've initiated a formal review," he said. "Compliance, finance, personnel conduct. It won't be quick." Margaret nodded. "It shouldn't be." Harold turned to Caleb. "You kept things from getting worse tonight." Caleb shook his head. "I didn't do much." Harold smiled faintly. "That's usually how it works." A new figure hovered a few steps away, uncertain whether to interrupt. He was in his late 40s, lean, with salt and pepper stubble, and the wary posture of someone who had spent years avoiding attention. His suit was unremarkable, his tie loosened, as if he had stopped caring midway through the evening. His name badge read Daniel Morse. "Operations Director?" Margaret noticed him immediately. "Mr. Morse," she said, "you look like you're carrying something." Daniel cleared his throat. "I am." He hesitated, then stepped closer. "I've worked here 12 years. I've seen good leaders and bad ones. I stayed quiet longer than I should have." Margaret regarded him steadily. "Why speak now?" Daniel swallowed. "Because tonight made it clear that silence has a cost. And because I don't want to pay it anymore." Margaret nodded slowly. "You're not the only one." Daniel's shoulders eased just slightly. He nodded and stepped back. already looking less burdened. When he was gone, Margaret turned to Caleb again. "This is the part no one celebrates," she said. "After the confrontation, after the headlines, the rebuilding." Caleb looked down at Val, who had lifted her head at the mention of movement and then settled again. "That's the hard part," he said. "Anyone can pull a trigger. Fewer can stay and clean up." Margaret's eyes sharpened. "That's why I asked you to stay." He met her gaze. "I'm not an executive." "No," she said. "You're a stabilizer. People feel safer when you're nearby, even if they don't know why." Caleb felt a familiar resistance rise. He had spent years dismantling expectations, avoiding roles that came with permanence. Yet, here it was again, the quiet invitation to stand where things mattered. "I can't promise long term," he said. Margaret smiled. "I'm not asking for forever, just for now." The hotel staff began dimming lights, signaling the end of the night. Outside, the wind had calmed, the harbor settling into a dark, reflective stillness. Security escorted Blake Ashford past them toward the exit. He did not look up. His face had taken on a gray pallor, the expression of a man replaying choices he could no longer revise. He glanced once at Margaret, then at Caleb, eyes flickering with resentment and something like fear. Val lifted her head, watching him go, but did not move. When Blake disappeared through the doors, the tension eased, not vanished, eased. Margaret exhaled slowly. "Tomorrow," she said, "will be worse." Caleb nodded. "It usually is." She extended her hand. He took it carefully, mindful of her injury. Her grip was firm, surprisingly warm. "I'm glad you were here tonight," she said. "So am I," he replied, surprised to find it was true. They parted near the entrance. Caleb clipped Val's leash back on, feeling the familiar weight settle into his palm. As they stepped outside, the cold air greeted them again, sharp but clean. The harbor lights shimmered, indifferent to human upheaval. Caleb paused on the steps, looking back once at the hotel. He had walked in intending to deliver a package and disappear. He was leaving with something heavier: involvement. Val leaned into his leg, sensing the shift. He rested a hand briefly on her head. "Looks like we're staying," he murmured. Her tail thumped once, slow and content. Behind them, inside the harbor crown, plans were already forming. Files would be opened, questions asked, silence accounted for. The reckoning had moved past spectacle. Now came the work. Morning came without ceremony. Charleston did not soften its edges for people who had slept poorly. The harbor woke under a pale, overcast sky, the kind that filtered sunlight into something flat and honest. Wind moved through the streets with the salt-heavy breath of the Atlantic, carrying the low groan of ships and the distant rattle of chains against steel. By 7 a.m., the city was already in motion, indifferent to whatever had broken the night before. Caleb Rowan woke before his alarm. Habit did that. Years of training had wired his body to rise before light, before permission. He lay still for a moment in the narrow hotel bed, listening. HVAC hum. A door closing somewhere down the hall, the faint, steady breathing at his side. Valkyrie lay curled on the carpet, her tan and black coat darkened slightly along her spine where age had thinned the fur. At 9 years old, she no longer slept as deeply as she once had. One ear lifted when Caleb shifted, then settled again when she recognized him. Her eyes opened halfway, amber and calm. "Morning, old girl," he murmured. Her tail thumped once against the carpet. Enough. Caleb dressed quietly. Jeans, boots, a gray shirt with the sleeves rolled just enough to reveal the old scar running along his left forearm. He clipped Val's leash on and stepped into the hallway, the smell of stale carpet cleaner and brewed coffee already lingering. Outside, Charleston felt different in daylight, less theatrical, more exposed. They walked toward the waterfront, Val moving at a measured heel, nails clicking softly against brick and pavement. People passed them, joggers, delivery workers, tourists clutching paper cups of coffee, none of whom knew or cared what had happened inside the harbor crown 12 hours earlier. That anonymity eased something in Caleb's chest. He stopped near the railing overlooking the water. The tide was low, exposing slick mud and the skeletal remains of old pilings. A pelican perched nearby, unmoved by their presence. "You'd like this place," he said to Val. "Too quiet for trouble." Val sniffed the air, then sat, posture straight despite the stiffness in her hind legs. She watched the water with interest, head tilted slightly, as if cataloging movement beneath the surface. Caleb's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Meeting at 9. Conference room B. Margaret requests your presence. He stared at the screen longer than necessary, then locked it and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Looks like work, he told Val. She glanced up at him, then back to the harbor. Unimpressed. The harbor crown looked smaller in daylight. Its glass facade reflected the gray sky without flair, the grand entrance reduced to something practical and transactional. Inside, the lobby had been reset, chairs straightened, tables cleared, the night's tension scrubbed away as thoroughly as housekeeping could manage, but the air still new. Caleb entered with Val at his side, heads turned, not with fear, not with curiosity exactly, but recognition. He was no longer just a passerby. He was part of the story now. Conference room B sat at the far end of the second floor. Inside, a long table filled most of the space. Coffee had been laid out with care, along with folders neatly arranged at each seat. The blinds were half open, letting in enough light to make the room feel alert without warmth. Margaret Holloway sat near the head of the table, her knee braced discreetly beneath the tablecloth. She wore a charcoal blazer over a soft blue blouse, her silver hair pulled back into a low, practical twist. She looked tired. She also looked unmovable. Harold Kincaid sat to her right, glasses perched low on his nose, reviewing documents. Thomas Reed was already there, posture rigid, pen aligned precisely with the edge of his folder. Daniel Moore stood near the window, arms crossed, staring out at the city below. In daylight, he looked leaner than he had the night before, the lines around his eyes more pronounced. His stubble was darker now, giving his face a perpetually unfinished look. He turned when Caleb entered and nodded once, respectful but reserved. "Mr. Rowan," Margaret said, "thank you for coming." Caleb inclined his head. "You asked." She gestured to a seat near the wall. "Please." Val lay down at his feet without instruction, settling with a huff that suggested resignation rather than fatigue. Margaret folded her hands on the table. "We're not here to relive last night," she said. "We're here to decide what comes after." No one argued. "Blake Ashford has been formally suspended pending investigation," Harold said. "Legal counsel has been notified. Security access revoked. He'll be escorted off company property permanently once personal effects are retrieved." Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "That was faster than I expected." Margaret looked at him. "Speed matters. So, does clarity?" Thomas nodded. "The concern now is exposure. Media inquiries have already started. There are videos circulating." Margaret's expression did not change. "There will always be videos. What matters is whether we have the truth ready before speculation becomes narrative." Caleb listened, recognizing the rhythm of crisis management. Control the perimeter, secure communications, establish facts before noise fills the void. "And internally?" Daniel asked. Margaret turned to him fully. "That's where you come in." Daniel straightened slightly. "Me? You know operations. You know where corners were cut and where silence settled in. I need that mapped." Daniel hesitated. "Some people won't like it." Margaret's voice was calm. "I'm not asking for popularity." Daniel nodded once. "Then I'm in." Margaret shifted her attention to Caleb. "And you?" He met her gaze evenly. "I'm not corporate." "No," she agreed. "You're external, neutral. People tell the truth more easily when they don't feel judged by hierarchy." Caleb considered that. "You want me in the room." "I want you visible," Margaret said, "not as enforcement, as reminder." "A reminder of what?" "That consequences exist," she replied, "and that restraint is a choice." Caleb glanced down at Val, then back at Margaret. "Temporary," he said. She smiled faintly. "Everything is." The door opened quietly, and a woman stepped in, pausing just inside the threshold. She was in her early 30s, tall and narrow-shouldered, with dark hair pulled into a severe bun that emphasized her sharp cheekbones. Her suit was immaculate, navy and fitted, the kind chosen by someone who believed details mattered because mistakes were expensive. "Apologies," she said. "I was told to join." Margaret nodded. "Yes. Thank you for coming, Ms. Carter." The woman approached the table, posture straight. "Emily Carter," she said, addressing the room. "Corporate counsel." Her eyes flicked briefly to Caleb, then to Val, assessing both without comment. "We'll need to prepare for litigation," Emily continued. "Blake Ashford has already retained representation. His position is that last night constituted public defamation. Harold snorted softly. Emily ignored it. Margaret met Emily's gaze. He pushed me to the ground. Emily nodded once. That will be central. Caleb noted the way Emily spoke, precise, unemotional. She had likely learned early that expressing outrage weakened arguments. The bigger risk, Emily added, is what surfaces during discovery. If internal complaints were ignored, they were, Daniel said quietly. Emily did not react. Then transparency will be essential. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, then reopened them. Good. I didn't build this company to hide behind lawyers. The meeting stretched on, details layering into strategy, timelines, communication plans, safeguards. By the time they adjourned, the coffee had gone cold, and the sky outside had brightened slightly, though the sun remained elusive. As people stood, Daniel lingered near Caleb. I didn't say this last night, Daniel said, lowering his voice. But thank you for standing where you did. Caleb shrugged. Someone needed to. Daniel smiled thinly. That's how it always starts. Margaret approached them, leaning lightly on the table for support. Mr. Rowan, she said, would you consider accompanying me this afternoon? To where? She smiled, just a little. Somewhere that reminds me why I started all this in the first place. Caleb hesitated, then nodded. As long as Val's welcome. Margaret glanced down at the dog, who lifted her head at the sound of her name. I wouldn't dream of excluding her. They parted soon after. Caleb stepped back into the hallway, Val at his side, feeling the quiet weight of commitment settle in his chest. This wasn't a mission. There was no extraction planned. But there was work. And work, he had learned, was sometimes the most dangerous thing of all. The drive took them out of the city before Caleb realized where Margaret was leading them. Charleston thinned gradually, the historic facades giving way to quieter neighborhoods, then to stretches of marshland where water and grass blurred into one living surface. The sky had finally broken open, clouds pulling apart to let sunlight spill across the low country in long, forgiving bands. Egrets lifted from the reeds as the car passed, white wings flashing briefly before settling again. Margaret sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded loosely in her lap. She wore dark sunglasses now, though the light was gentle, not harsh. Pain still lived in her knee. Caleb could see it in the way she shifted occasionally, but it no longer commanded her attention. Some things, once set in motion, dulled everything else. Val lay in the back seat, stretched across a blanket Margaret had insisted on bringing. Her muzzle had gone almost entirely gray, and her breathing carried the faint rasp of a dog, who had run hard for most of her life. Still, her eyes tracked the passing landscape with interest, ears lifting whenever they crossed a bridge or the road curved unexpectedly. Not many people know this place exists, Margaret said after a while. Caleb glanced at her. That usually means it matters. She smiled. It always did to me. They turned off the main road onto a narrow drive lined with live oaks. Spanish moss hung from the branches like old thoughts that refused to fall away. At the end of the drive stood a modest structure, weathered wood, wide porch, nothing grand about it. Beyond it stretched open land sloping gently toward the water. This, Margaret said, was the first warehouse. Caleb parked and stepped out. The air smelled different here, brackish, clean, alive. He walked a few paces, boots crunching softly on gravel, and took in the place. It wasn't impressive in the way corporate headquarters were impressive. It was honest. I started here with 6 people, Margaret continued, joining him slowly. Business, no capital, no guarantees, just contracts I couldn't afford to lose and a belief that doing things right would matter eventually. And did it? Caleb asked. She looked out over the marsh. Eventually. They stood in silence for a moment. Val hopped down from the car with a grunt, joints protesting, then trotted forward, nose to the ground. She stopped near the edge of the grass, sniffed, and sat, tail sweeping lazily behind her. Margaret watched her fondly. She reminds me of some of my early employees, she said. Older than they look, smarter than anyone gives them credit for. Caleb huffed a quiet laugh. She's earned her rest. So have you, Margaret said. He shrugged. Not sure I'm built for it. Margaret turned to face him fully, Up close, her age showed in the fine lines around her eyes and the faint tremor in her hands. But there was nothing fragile about her presence. She was a woman who had survived success as thoroughly as she had survived loss. "I've spent years stepping away," she said, "convincing myself the company would remember what I taught it." "And did it?" Caleb asked again. She shook her head. "Organizations forget. People forget. That's not a failure. It's a reality." Caleb considered that. In the teams he had served with, memory was maintained through ritual and accountability. Miss either one, and standards eroded quickly. "I don't want to rebuild the past," Margaret continued. "I want to rebuild the culture, and then I want to leave it in hands that understand restraint." Caleb felt the weight of her words settle. "You're asking for guardians, not commanders." "Yes," she said simply. They walked toward the old warehouse. The door creaked as Margaret pushed it open, revealing a space that smelled faintly of wood and oil. Sunlight filtered through dusty windows, illuminating faded markings on the floor where equipment had once been staged. "This is where I learned the difference between speed and haste," Margaret said, "between authority and respect." Caleb ran a hand along a workbench scarred by decades of use. "Same lesson," he said. "Different classroom." Margaret leaned against the bench, careful of her knee. "You don't need to stay forever," she said, "but while you're here, you can help set a tone that lasts longer than either of us." Val padded inside and settled near the doorway, positioning herself so she could see both the interior and the land beyond, always watching the thresholds. "I can help with structure," Caleb said slowly. "Boundaries. Processes that don't rely on fear." Margaret nodded. "That's exactly what I need." They stepped back outside. The wind stirred the grass, rippling it like water. In the distance, a horse moved along a fence line, chestnut-colored, tall and lean, mane darkened by sweat. It paused, ears pricked, watching them. Margaret followed Caleb's gaze. "That's Jasper," she said. "Belongs to a neighbor. Old ranch horse, retired mostly, still likes to patrol the fence." Jasper snorted softly and resumed his slow walk, hooves steady, unhurried. "Even when they slow down," Caleb said, "they keep watch." Margaret smiled. "Because someone has to." They returned to the car in companionable silence. As they drove back toward the city, Caleb felt something unfamiliar settle into place. Not certainty, not peace exactly, but alignment. The sense that the next step, while undefined, was at least pointed in the right direction. By the time they reached Charleston again, the afternoon had softened into something almost kind. Phones buzzed with updates, statements drafted, meetings scheduled, plans unfolding, but the urgency felt different now, less frantic, more deliberate. Back at the Harbor Crown, Margaret paused before getting out of the car. She removed her sunglasses and looked at Caleb directly. "You could have walked away last night," she said. "Most people would have." He thought of the moment in the lobby, the push, the silence that followed. "Someone didn't," he replied. She extended her hand. He took it, this time without hesitation. "Then we'll walk forward instead," she said. Inside, the building buzzed with controlled activity. Employees moved with purpose, not panic. Val walked at Caleb's side, head high, tail relaxed. People noticed. Some smiled, some straightened. Small things, but meaningful ones. As they passed through the lobby, Caleb caught his reflection in the glass, older than he felt, steadier than he remembered being. Val glanced up at him, then ahead, content. For the first time in a long while, the path forward did not feel like an extraction. It felt like a beginning. Sometimes God doesn't arrive with thunder. No lightning, no loud voice from the sky. Sometimes his miracles come quietly, in the form of a stranger who chooses kindness, a dog who refuses to walk away, a tired soul who still stands up when it would be easier to stay silent. This story isn't just about justice. It's about what happens when compassion outlives fear, when patience becomes strength, and when doing the right thing, quietly, without applause, changes everything. In our daily lives, we may never face a ballroom full of witnesses, but every day we face smaller moments. Moments where we can turn away, or stay. Moments where we can be silent, or protect someone weaker than us. Those moments matter, because God often works through ordinary people who choose extraordinary mercy. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who may be losing hope. Leave a comment and tell us what part stayed with you the most. And subscribe to this channel so you never miss stories that remind us goodness still exists. May God bless you wherever you are watching from. May He protect your family, your children, and every animal who depends on human kindness. And may you always recognize the quiet miracles when they pass through your life. Until next time.